Good afternoon, or good evening, should I say, NGA. This is Square Dragon of No Goblins Allowed, and we are just on the cusp of starting the MTGA tournament organised by the fantastic sponsors, organisers, Cucho, Holy, probably a raft of other people as well to be thanked. I think it's pretty exciting. I think most of us felt a bit let down when Magic Duels ended, in particular the way it did. They never released the Hour of Devastation, which was a bit of a blow to everybody, which should not be the natural. We knew Duels was going to end, but the way it ended left a bit of a bad taste. And there were people that got used to playing, and some of them maybe decided that was it, they'd had enough. The other difficult thing with Arena is it was always envisaged to be format PC, and of course the PC in Magic Duels had quite a community of supporters, so obviously they were clearly going to be looking to get into Arena straight away, but of course there was a equally strong community of the Xbox 360 or the Xbox One. So those guys, I guess, probably felt it a bit because they haven't really been able to get into the action without obviously having to go full on PC mode. But we are where we are. The game's come to be into what they refer to as open beta. Those of us that started and went into it when it first came out were part of the sign up for the closed beta. We now have open beta, and there have been a number of improvements, adjustments to get the game to the state it is now, which I think is a pretty good build. To be honest, I don't really see much in the way of tweaks or changes apart from some modes, etc. And of course, on that subject, one of the big modes that I think everybody was asking for and waiting for was the ability to do the casual matches. Not so much in terms of, isn't online gaming these days about playing in teams, playing with like-minded friends, etc. But it was more about what we lost when Duels ended, when we had such great organised tournaments. I was involved myself in the IOS. I mean, it wasn't the IOS tournaments probably because of the number of participants, and yes, arguably not necessarily the best players out there, but we enjoy the game. And even Covert himself, who has been a great player from the start, got back into Magic the Gathering via the iOS platform initially, but then quickly realised that he wanted to be joining the more accomplished, the more dedicated, if that's a better word, players, which some were obviously on the PC. They had a really good, strong community, but of course there was a equally strong bunch of players and competitive, good players, good deck builders on the Xbox platform, which is of course where CVG, Covert Go Blue, gravitated towards. So when Duels ended, Covert, amongst others, it's interesting because I've been in touch with them, and I still have an early interesting comment from him saying, nah, you know, he was going to leave Arena. He didn't really think I'm getting into it. Of course, I'm pleased to say in a way as well, because he's always been he was a great contributor in his diaries, if those of you that remember that. Anyway, I'll end there to say it's good Arenas to be back. In particular, we now have this fantastic Undercity Coliseum tournament. Many thanks again to the organisers. You know, people can forget, I'm sure we don't, but we can forget the amount of sort of effort, planning, coordination, thought, work, etc. that goes into these things. So the fact the turnaround, or the turnout should I say, for this tournament has been as high as what we're up to, 400 or something, is just incredible really. I think even in the wildest imagines in Magic Duel days where most of certainly the PC were oversubscribed, the Xbox One was heavily subscribed. We always struggled in iOS, but we, for the first few tournaments, we got enough players interested in joining together and dedicating themselves to participating and taking part in a tournament. So we're at the first, certainly from an MGA point of view, organised, and I think it's great that the community's been bound together. There have been players, arguably, that haven't got into Arena, and particularly in the Xbox, and I call out to people like Black Barney, for example, who have stuck with NGA, they've got involved, they've followed the game. People like DJ as well, who was again a very clever thinker as far as Magic's concerned. His insights into the cards, the decks, and meta was always interesting to watch. When the guys used to do the card review sets when Magic Duel was around, that was always a great session to attend. They used to do the stream on that, so if you could join Twitch, it was worth watching. But equally, if they recorded it, you could catch it on YouTube. Always well worth watching. I've always been a big fan as well of the Pro Tour, so in Magic Duels I used to look forward to seeing what the professionals are up to, so to speak, and picking up some tips. And that, obviously that's continued with Arena, although the card collection, the card pool, is something that creates or presents challenges, shall we say. It gone are the days where we'd happily grind our socks off to get a full collection with Magic Duels, and therefore you could. It was a lot of that. There were two things going on, which has always been the case in Magic. It's about building the best decks and piloting the best decks. That still continues to be the case in Arena, but it gets more difficult to assemble without putting in a lot more money. And yeah, I think nobody would argue that Wizards in the continued development of Magic the Gathering is such a fantastic game, so why wouldn't you want to support it? So but I remain a free to play. There is different reasons for that. I mean, it's not financials is not the issue, it's just more time and effort really to put into the game. I don't have as much as some people obviously do. And yeah, with Covert Go Blue trying to go as full time as he can on it, that's fantastic, because he's such a good player, he's such a good contributor to the game, and such a good content creator. Anyway, without further ado, I'll present my deck, which again, this is on my own account, so again, I'm a free to play player, but I've been playing since the early the closed beta days I was around, the open beta days I've been playing. So I came up with this deck, which some of it is probably fairly heavily influenced by, it's not a net deck per se, because I think I've got some interesting ideas in here, but quite a lot of the key components, the things that are maybe a bit unusual in a standard Drake deck, which on the surface this is, are a bit different. But anyway, let's get into the deck and I'll try and explain what I mean. So the first cards at the top, the dive down really is where I took this inspiration, so kind of net deck idea in a way, from I think it's Andrew Sullivan that won one of the recent tours of that, and he was running a Jeskai list, but one of the ideas that he brought with looking at running the Drakes in particular and Niv-Mizzet in particular was using the idea of dive down to protect, because of all the removal that goes around. And of course, the great thing I like about the Drake deck is that the longer the game goes on, and particularly when the spells have hit the graveyard, you end up with a 3 mana Drake, the 3 mana Enigma Drake, being quite a potential game winner even at any stage, just because he gets stronger and stronger as the game goes on when more spells hit the graveyard. But the idea of getting one of the Drakes out, or Niv-Mizzet in particular, and being able to protect it from the obvious removal that's going to be coming down with a dive down, I think is kind of makes sense. So the rest of the deck, and this main deck for me, it was more driven around just the typical good spells to have available, in terms of if you think about the Drake deck as being part controlling as well as creature based, and obviously the evasion is key with the flyers. This main deck, I think I had more in my original, we'll come back to the sideboard, but I had more creatures in the original sideboard, but I think from memory, I think I only have one more creature, and we'll come to the sideboard when we look at it. So the rest of the list really is just trying to drive for some of the good cards, almost, if you like, from a control. So it's controlling to the extent that it wants good draw, it wants good removal, and it wants to be fixing its mana. So some of the spells like Opt, for example, the card draw with Chart a Course, and what I think are some of the best remover available in red, with Lava Coil in particular hitting the 4 toughness. So for some of the bigger creatures that come out, and Lightning Strike. So I don't run any shocks on this, which I've seen Pro Tour versions running shock. I think Lightning Strike, it's designed to try and hit things like, Wild Growth Walker when it hits in Golgari, to stop it getting out of control, gaining life, etc. In the Pro Tour deck with Jeskai, they ran 4 treasure maps, and this is, in this particular build, where I come up against the limitations of a free-to-play player, because both the treasure maps, I think, which are key to the idea in particular of having the mana available almost on curve, or even earlier than that in some ways, for Niv in particular, is pretty important, right? So in the Jeskai list, which obviously runs white in addition to blue and red, I think 4 treasure maps made sense, because you could rely on the ramp for any color, and of course the treasure map, it's not a rare without a reason, really. So I had to craft, i.e. convert wildcards to get to the treasure maps. What's interesting about the deck as well, as a free-to-player point of view, I bought one of the guilds of Ravnica Planeswalker decks, the actual RAL. As I said in the NGA thread, Izzet's always been, in Magic terms, one of the guilds, or one of the mechanics, the card draw, the draw card, do damage. I think I've always been interested in, there have been good Izzet decks in the past, and I think with the latest guilds of Ravnica, some of the spells that were coming out, particularly the Jumpstart's interesting. We'll come back to that. I don't run quite so many Jumpstarts, but it's an interesting idea, and it works. It's probably designed with the Izzet guild in mind as well. So I run the removal of Lava Coil and Lightning Strike. I have 3 of each. I go up to 4 in the sideboard, which we'll see later. Again, I don't go up to 4 lightning strikes, but I do go up to the 4 lava coils, and that's just because lava coils can hit bigger creatures, and particularly in the mirror, where if you're going up against the mirror, and that obviously the drakes, all the drakes, apart from Niv, who's bigger, but the main drake, Crackling, and even like, okay, the Phoenix in that category maybe, and the Enigma Drake come out with 4 toughness, so Lava Coil handles that better. So we have the spells for card draw, opt really for, I guess, fixing the draw as much as anything. Because we're in Izzet, and again, this comes back to, I think I'd opened at some point in time the 5 mana cost Ral Izzet Viceroy, but the Ral Collar of Storms came with a paper deck. Something that's interesting for those of you who only play digital, don't go into paper. The neat thing about Arena, and maybe what they tried to do with Duels before, was to get people interested into play Magic, and particularly again, whether it's a digital version, Magic the Gathering Online, but obviously paper is where I arguably Wizards have put the money into, and how the game's developed is the Pro Tours obviously play paper. So the neat thing about Arena, if you haven't realised, is if you go and buy some of these decks, and I guess that'll be the case in future. So in my case, the Ral Planeswalker deck, you actually end up with that being unlocked in Arena. You get a code, you put it in, and it unlocks all the cards. So in some ways, I think that helped me get to the list I'm running now. It was, as I mentioned, Izzet's favourite guild, so obviously the Ral Planeswalker deck was something I was interested in buying paper. I played paper for a while. I do it casually. I've never done Friday Night Magic or anything serious, but I've just enjoyed, in the days of Magic Duels, buying paper versions and trying to play paper as you do online with the digital versions. My son, who doesn't play so much, he really stopped playing with Magic Duels, didn't get into Arena. Magic Master still plays, so we both of us still play paper, so we have that still, but he doesn't get involved with Arena, and he was quite heavily involved with Duels when it was running, but he dropped that when Arena came along because he doesn't play on PC, he plays on his Xbox. So the deck, again, as a free-to-play player, the mana base potentially ends up being an issue for some because rare lands, rare wildcards convert to rare lands, and arguably you need to be properly competitive, you need a good mana base, which needs cost, and that's through paper as well as digital. But yeah, I had Sulphur Falls, I think, which was a free bono with the decks that you get with Arena when you first sign up and play some matches and get into the game. The Steam vents, I think, are all one. So the actual mana in here is purely from opening. I don't think I've used any of the rare cards to get to those, and arguably the deck might run slightly better if I had done, but at least with having 2 Steam vents and 1 Sulphur Falls, it helps the mana a bit. The other thing, going back to the free to play and back to the original Pro Tour version in Jeskai, which had 4 treasure maps, I decided to put Arcane Encyclopedia. Of course, it's not a complete replacement, but it kind of does a similar job. So Arcane Encyclopedia, I think, is interesting so if we think about my take, or my tech, if you like, Arcane Encyclopedia, I think, is one of them. And of course, when we get to Niv, and he wants to be drawing cards and doing damage and just keeping that train going, Arcane Encyclopedia works really well with that, because Arcane Encyclopedia, is it's pay 3, draw a card. So why wouldn't you want to draw a card if you're playing Izzet, and then the mechanics that engenders, doing damage and the card draw and everybody knows, I think, and that's again coming back to why I like Izzet so much. Everybody knows that probably one of the most important, or one of the best mechanics arguably in Magic the Gathering, is card draw, almost kind of bar none, because if the game is all about getting the cards to play the game, and if you're mana screwed or if you're flooding, fixing mana, etc., but to get the right cards at the right time in any deck is pretty important. So card drawing and being able to fix and get the cards you want has always been key. So this is why Treasure Map, with its scry ability, obviously helps that, and then later on it's a card draw engine as well once it transforms. But the scry early days fixes in the same way that Opt does. So Opt isn't ramping in any way, but it is fixing in terms of being able to scry, particularly if you're scrying for land. And of course it's got card draw, of course. So it's a synergy as it gets. I run this main deck version, which I think is very similar to the Pro Tour version if I think back to it. So they had other creatures, but they were more white creatures like Lyra, for example. Obvious choice, obviously, in a sideboard for life gain, etc. But the main deck, I think, from the Pro Tour version was running these 13 creatures in the deck, and of course it's 13 creatures that all have evasion, either all flying. So, and the Rekindling Phoenix, again, for me, that's the Rekindling Phoenix wasn't crafted from wildcards. It comes with one of the standard decks you get. So, being able to run it in here, and it fits a theme. Get flyers in the air that are, need to be either answered, removed. And Rekindling Phoenix has the advantage, of course, of those of you who know the card, it comes back. So you really need to spend at least 2 removal spells, which puts it at a premium, and it's a reason it's a mythic as a card rather than just being the rare. It's interesting that Niv is rare only rather than mythic. Would have made it more difficult for me to assemble all 4 copies, but as I said, 2 of them were probably 2 of them were open from just opening packs, and 2 of them were crafted. And again, I think having all 4 is are legendary, so you can only really have 1 out at a time. But having 4 means that you want to be sure you're going to draw Niv, and it's key to the way this deck wants to run. Okay, so enough about that. As I said, in this main deck, one of the interesting things was there's no jumpstart, and I don't know, I argued about, or agonized, or whatever you do when you do these, trying to build these decks. In no ways I'm really a competent, well, I suppose semi-competent. I kind of understand mana curve and creatures and the balance and all that good stuff, but it's recognizing the synergies and some of the weird mechanic stuff that goes on. I'm not that type of player. I guess I don't play enough Magic is what it boils down to, but then I don't spend enough time when the card sets come out looking at all the lists and suddenly thinking, oh yeah, I know how these cards are going to work. But anyway, the interesting thing, we'll come on to actually the sideboard in a minute, so bear with me, but some of the cards in here, I mean, these dual cards, always interesting really, because it just gives you options, whether it's copying a spell in the early game, which you might need, but of course the right hand side of the card, dealing X damage to any target, is acting a bit like Banefire, which we're going to see in the sideboard. So I mean, those sort of cards, and again, I've got a one-off, arguably you could run more, but this, I think, expansion probably came from the Planeswalker deck, if I'm honest. I think it does have at least 1 copy, so of course I get one because I bought the paper version, put the code in. So it comes back to the fact that the reason that this was a good list for me as a free-to-play pair to run is because I think I end up with quite a few of the cards that make the deck work or complete the deck and make it a bit more closer to what you might find in a Pro Tour. And for that reason, you can see the complete set of Crackling Drakes and Enigma Drakes and Niv, which are making up the 12 creatures, and then of course Rekindling Phoenix with the free Bono from just playing the game and doing that. The sideboard was interesting because I had a completely different take on the sideboard, and again, sideboarding is not something that I could claim again through not really playing sideboards and even in paper really. Well, me and Magic Master go through phases of saying let's build a deck, let's put a sideboard in, see how it goes. So it's an interesting idea, and of course the art of sideboarding is a completely different thing. I mean, even Covert himself, he puts out great content, but of course he's starting to show some of the sideboard side of things. But even with the experience he has, he's saying, well, sideboard is a different skill. So this is where we miss, in my opinion, we miss players like DJ, for example, who unfortunately doesn't play Arena because he was, again, I think he might have been under the Xbox domain. I think he was an Xbox player, and just doesn't get into it. But his insights in the game have always been fantastic. So he's the type of player that would look at lists, look at new cards coming out, and come up with this really, really crazy but very, very competitive deck. So sideboard, always an issue. My initial build of this just kind of went more flyers, big flyers, etc. and that. And of course, DJ put out quite an interesting, I think there was another NGA poster that put out, I think, a decent post about how to think about sideboarding. Basically look at each of the main meta, if you like, look at kind of what makes them tick, and look at putting in cardboards that counter that or work against that, like aggro, etc., etc. So I don't know, when I did the first build, I wasn't really paying attention to that, or it didn't really come in. And the interesting thing, my initial sideboard, you wouldn't credit it, again, for me it was something that I had the cards, and but I wasn't even considering putting them in the main deck or otherwise, or even the sideboard, is Beacon Bolt. So you see I've gone up to 3 copies of Beacon Bolt, and of course, yes, this is the Jumpstart card, so I probably got at least one of them, and I've gone up to 3, and I think 3 is the maximum I've got anyway. 3 Beacon Bolts, which is Jumpstart, is interesting. I think the Jumpstart for me, the reason I was not initially keen to put a lot of Jumpstart into the main deck is because it's fine, Jumpstart 1, cast a card, but it's the second casting of it you've got to discard a card. Now, I guess I wasn't thinking about the fact that you may have a card that just is in your deck, either it's a land that you don't really need anymore, or another card that's not really affecting the board. So yeah, it's, from that point of view, it's great. Get rid of one card and you've got this quite powerful effect. And again, Beacon Bolt gets better the more spells, so it works in exactly the same way that the Drakes do, in terms of they get better and better as time goes on. But of course, at least I've got them in. It makes sense, I think. And again, it was watching one of the early Pro Tours where they talked about Beacon Bolt, and somebody mentioned, I think there may even have been somebody as high profile as Luis Scott Vargas or whoever was commentating, or it might have been on a site saying, yeah, Beacon Bolt is a choice, one of the best cards in the set. So why was I excluding them? Well, that's just again an example of I don't build or think about things like I should, but I still enjoy the game. So I'm really happy to have this list. In this list as well, something that I think is I would say SD tech. So when you look at, is this a net deck? I suspect probably not, because, and again, when I look at, the more I think about gravitic punch, if that's the way to pronounce it, and you can see it's jumpstart, which is, I can cast it once, I can cast it the second time, but for those of you who have been around Magic, where we talk about different decks, and if you're in the know, you think, oh, I know that deck when they're talking about it. But I'm sure those of you who've been around Magic long enough have heard of the Fling deck. And of course, the Fling deck was all about having this really cheap spell, get a nice big creature, big toughness, and basically use that to do direct damage, throw it basically, hence the name Fling, at the opponent's face. So very, very powerful, and Fling decks became quite popular, building them, you know, ramping up, getting some big fat creatures out, and then throwing them at the opponent, and of course for a very cheap cost. And of course I think that's what makes the Fling decks quite powerful, quite a good mechanic. This I see as being a kind of an equivalent. It is. I mean, it's doing the same thing. It takes the target creature you control and deals damage equal to its power target player. So if you think about the main deck, we have flyers that, particularly as to what the game gets on and you get stall or whatever, you're just trying to win, and you've got flyers and they get better as times go on. But you have the flyer and you can throw in for damage, but imagine a big Drake or even Niv being out on the battlefield, and typically the main deck is all about getting Niv out and basically letting Niv take over the game with all the card draw and the do one damage and draw another card and, you know, cast again. That's the kind of mechanics of the deck. Very much so. As I said, Izzet is, you know, definitely the mechanic that favours drawing cards, and as I said earlier on, it's probably one of the best mechanics that Magic has, because drawing cards gets you a better chance to get the cards that you need to win the game. So I'm sorry about going on, but of course if I'm making, and this is just going to be a sideboarding, and of course it was a bit of a history of Magic and some of the comments of how I play or where I come into the game, and then just some final comments. So the other thing I did, and coming back to finish this off, and again I think really going back to some of the points that I think DJ was making about sideboarding, is, you know, really think about, you know, the way he thinks about decks is, okay, put your main deck together, make it as good as you can, and then start looking at all this different meta that you're going to be facing, and put in cards in your sideboard that basically counter that, make those decks worse, or, you know, somehow negate their power. And you're right, you know, when he explains it, he said you might end up with 30 cards in the deck, and then of course it's the case then you've got a starting point and you whittle down, so you get to your sideboard list. So coming back to my so dive down, I have dive down in the main deck. I think it's coming back, or it's coming back to the nod of dive down. Now again, coming back to the Pro Tour version, the Jeskai Sullivan's deck, I think only had 2 dive downs. I think he may even have had both in the sideboard. I need to check back, but if you got the Drakes out and removals running riot, which of course it will do because they're big threats, then yeah, why not? It's having an extra dive down, and of course the key about dive down is just how cheap it can be. So ideally you want to be putting a big flying threat out with the 1 blue mana available, so that if you get the usual stuff bubbles up, you can counter it. Yeah, very, very effective. I mean, Magic's a lot like that, you know. I think those of us who are not as good deck builders, and maybe arguably not as good players as well, suddenly when you look at how people build decks and the way people play, you think, oh god, it's obvious, isn't it? Right, of course it is. But it's like anything. Once you see it in practice, you think, of course, yeah, it makes sense in that. But of course, that's why the guys, particularly the Pro Tour guys that get these new sets in a very short space of time, and suddenly they're coming out, they're trying to crack the meta, as it's called, and they want to be coming up with the best deck that's going to do well in these Pro Tour events. So that remains a fascinating aspect of anybody that enjoys Magic so much. I just think watching the fact that always happens, they keep the game fresh with the new mechanics coming out, the new cards, and obviously the rotation, I think, is arguably the rotation keeps it fresh, but it also keeps people buying cards as well. So they're not daft, I guess, but it does keep Magic the Gathering, I think, constantly being something that's worth watching, because you never know what's coming up next. So in the deck, to finish off the sideboard, putting counter effectively, transforming it more into a control deck, or more of a control deck than it might already be, by putting in the cheap counters. Essence Scatter, counter creature spell, doesn't work against things like Carnage Tyrant, obviously, but it would work against a lot of other threats that might come out. Negate, likewise. One of the main reasons for having negate in are, again, in some ways for control, or people like running white, Settle the Wreckage, good example. And if we go back to the main deck, Ionize for me is, it obviously, when you have any spell that's a counter spell, and of course Ionize in the Izzet colours, again, you can see it's a rare, is a rare because it's 3 mana and it does counter spell but the 2 damage to the controller, so it's a really, 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 really powerful effect. And ideally, when I'm running just the main deck, I really, really don't want to cast Ionize until much later on in the game. In particular, Ionize, from my point of view, is great to have in your hand when you've got the Drakes out that are causing problems. And of course, when anybody's running white, you're always running against the threat of Settle the Wreckage, of course. So in testing, I've had quite a few games against white, and if you have Ionize as a counter, it can be a great blowout, because you've got big Drakes that are going to come in. Normally you want to be doing that when it's lethal. If you're not lethal yet, you can send 1 Drake, and they obviously don't want to cast, but lulling them into the sense of saying, well, I'll wait because I've got Settle the Wreckage, and boom, you send in all the Drakes for lethal damage, they cast Settle the Wreckage, and you say, sorry buddy, Ionize, excellent. So that's main deck. But coming back to the sideboard, I really have negate for similar types of effects, or any non, Vraska's Contempt. There's a whole bunch of non-creature spells that for 2 mana negate, I think, just puts a different onus on this sideboard. So I go up to the extra lava coil. Maybe it's lava coil is having an extra lava coil doing 4 damage hits a lot of decks. It's an extra burns, it's an extra sort of creature removal, if you like, and it's cheap enough even for the sort of aggro decks or Boros that come out with creatures that you need to deal with. Gravitic Punch I've mentioned, which I just think is, as I said, for me this is SD tech, because I just see it as being, double fling effectively. So you've got fling once, even if it gets countered, it's jumpstart, so you get a second chance. So having 2 of them in the sideboard, 4 mana is pretty decent in this deck, I think. By the time you're getting to 4 mana to get Crackling Drake out. So once you're at 4 mana, having a Crackling Drake out, and with enough spells behind it, Nezahal is just an excellent card. It's bloody pricey, of course, but it's another uncounterable spell. So more from the point of view, and when an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card. So it's almost like a win more, really. Discard 3 cards, exile Nezahal, return it to the battlefield, tap, blah blah blah, and all the rest of it. So I think it there may be better sideboard cards, but I just, in a blue deck where you want to bring just something in, and again, control. Control doesn't want to put it off. They have planeswalkers and all that sort of nonsense going on. So yeah, a one-off Nezahal, and again, I've only got one because I think you get Nezahal as part of a free Bono again. So this is again just trying to rely on the fact that having Nezahal in the sideboard, and yet probably only ever would sideboard in against control, because control wants to go long game, get a lot of mana, blah blah blah. So, and then Banefire in the sideboard rather than being the main deck, again just anti-control. So again, once we get up to 5 or more mana, can't be countered, great finisher. So that's the deck. It's a long monologue from me. I hope you find it useful. I'm really excited to play this. As I say, I don't get as much time to play as I would most of the time I'm playing. I'm just trying to grind. So I'm currently here. I have been saving. I was spending to sort of grind, but I've got 9 going on 10 packs to open at some point in time. But I think I'm just going to keep playing in that. I'm quite happy to see how this deck does. I think it deserves to do well. I mean, I might not. If it fails, it'll probably be failing because I don't play it properly. So I'm trying to get practice in. But I think the build's pretty good. Coming back as a final word, the sideboard swap outs, the big targets for me in terms of cards that I would take out and almost like completely replace, again depending on the matchup. If it's against control, I'd probably leave the planeswalkers in, but against anything else, I'd probably swap out both planeswalkers. And the other one that would probably go, which is again 3 slots, in terms of bringing in from the sideboard, would be the Lightning Strike. So I think Lightning Strike, as far as it goes, is good. It's good to have it in the game early. It can deal with some of the problematic, explore creatures, for example, in the early game. But if you're not up against that type of deck, I'd swap those out. I'd ship them out, and probably, even if I was replacing like for like with Beacon Bolt, for example, that would probably be a decent swap, given that I'm relying on being able to then make more use of the jumpstart ability of the jumpstart cards. Okay, thanks for watching, everyone, and I look forward to maybe trying to run a few practice games of this deck in best of 3, so that you can get an idea of laugh at me trying to play it properly, but also get an idea of if and when I'm playing it properly or near properly. I've had some good results with testing it so far. I'll try and put some of those out so that you can get an idea, particularly when you go from the transition from the first game, which is obviously main deck, to swapping out the sideboard. Thanks again, everyone, for watching, if you have done and you've stuck with it, and I strongly encourage you to visit No Goblins Allowed, the site, and follow the thread and follow the results, watch the videos, support the content creators, and hope you enjoy watching. This is Squid or Dragon, No Goblins Allowed, and for me it's good night.